This video falls into our topic of exploring specifications. This one is about the term dual wavelength. Okay, now wavelengths on lasers you'll generally see are going to be in the infrared spectrum or the red wavelength, which is visible light. Okay, and so when we're talking about dual wavelength lasers, that can be a class 3 or class 4. Usually they'll have them. Okay, and that term dual wavelength, however, is more something that's been used by some class 4 companies. And now there's a subtle difference between dual wavelength function and a laser that has two wavelengths. Okay, I know that sounds really confusing, and I'll explain in a second. So I'm just going to use one company as an example. There's a couple other companies that do this. K-Laser, for example, as a lot of their marketing and appearing very different than other lasers. They'll talk about their dual wavelength on a few of their models. And actually one of their models even has more than two wavelengths. So the dual wavelength function is on some of these devices, it runs two different wavelengths, usually in the infrared spectrum, the whole time. And you can't really shut off one wavelength. So you just turn on the laser and it delivers two different wavelengths. Okay, into the tissue, and that's deemed to have better efficacy. Totally unproven, by the way. No studies, nothing. Okay, so now that function, why I also want to explore this, is that what we do know from studies, okay, about efficacy is that efficacy comes down to the irradiation, the amount of joules on one single wavelength coming out of one diode, irradiating it in an area of tissue. Okay, so what happens when you have dual wavelength? If you look at their marketing, and there's a few other companies that do this as well, it appears that they're trying to convince you that having two different wavelengths go into the tissue in an area is somehow going to increase the efficacy. Again, this is not true. This is not proven. And in fact, what is actually proven to have more efficacy is if they actually had combined the power from both of those diodes into one diode. So when you have the dual wavelength function and it's automatically running on the device the whole time, you take your total power, which might be, let's say, 10 watts to keep it simple, and you divide that in two. So it's actually 5 watts is going to each beam, 5 watts. So when you actually look at the efficacy and you look at power density and all that kind of stuff, you'll see that the laser actually performs as if, imagine this, that you had two different lasers. One was, and they were both 5-watt lasers. Okay, so think about that for a second. You have two lasers in your hand, 5-watt lasers. Okay, so how will these lasers perform on the body? Let's say we're just using one. It's a 5-watt laser. It's not a 10-watt laser. It's a 5-watt laser, 5,000 milliwatts. It will perform like a 5-watt laser. Okay, but they're trying to convince you that when you take these two lasers, you combine them together, this equals a 10-watt laser. This is not true. This is not true in terms of what would have more efficacy potentially or more versatility would be a laser that was 10 watts coming on a single wavelength from a single diode. Okay, now, and I would just kind of add this because it's similar and you should know about it, but if you see multiple diodes, to calculate actually how much, you always want to make sure basically that when you look at the total power, you want to see how many diodes it's coming out of, how it's being dispersed is the term, dispersion. So you might have you know, a 100-watt laser, okay, which doesn't exist, by the way. That'd be huge, right? But you might have 10 diodes. Okay, so what's coming out of each diode? 10 watts. What's the advantage to having more diodes? No, it's not really always necessarily advantageous per se. And I'm actually going to cover that in another video. But really, that laser that says 100 watts actually is performing like a 10-watt laser. So that's a really important point there. Now there are some lasers which are considered better, just better lasers, better brands, better quality, and they actually allow you to control the wavelength. If it has two wavelengths as options, it allows you to control the power going to each one separately. Okay, that's real versatility. Now, I only know of one manufacturer that does that and sells to a couple companies. So you can have like a 940 nanometer. You can do, you know, whatever the power is that you get. You can have 25 watts going to that one wavelength and 5 going to the other wavelength, or 30 all on one, 0 on the other. It's totally up to you. That's ideally what you want. Now, some of these other lasers have even more than dual wavelengths. Sometimes they'll offer a third wavelength or a fourth. You just have to keep on dividing and to see how the actual laser is really performing. Now you bring that back into the cost of that device, and you can actually figure out, wow, they're charging me that much for actually half of the power. So it's a little tricky when you have to kind of conceptualize it that way. If you have any more questions about what I'm talking about, just send me an email real quick. Give me a call. Be happy to speak with you.